Anabaptist communities began to emerge in South Germany and Austria very soon after the first baptisms in Zurich, and before the movement was widespread in Swiss towns and villages. Leaders of these communities were aware of the Swiss Brethren. Hans Denk, a key figure in South German Anabaptism, had visited Anabaptists in St. Gall before being baptised. He also met Balthasar Hubmaier in Augsburg in 1525 and Michael Sattler in Strasbourg in 1526. But South German and Austrian Anabaptism was markedly different from Swiss Anabaptism in its origin and emphases. Hans Denk contributed another strand to South German Anabaptism. Temperamentally quite different from the firebrands who were inspired by Münzer, he nevertheless shared their interest in mysticism. Denk was a classical scholar who became a supporter of the Reform movement and was appointed to a teaching post in Nuremberg. Although he may have encountered Münzer there in 1524, Denk did not become involved in the peasants' movement, but his dubious associations resulted in him being identified as a radical and expelled from the city. After visiting Swiss cities where the Anabaptist movement was in evidence, and being imprisoned for challenging the practice of infant baptism, he returned to German territory. At some point he was baptised, because he was an Anabaptist leader in Augsburg by the end of 1525. Denk died of the plague in November 1527, but in his 2 years as an Anabaptist leader he helped to lay the foundations of the movement in South Germany. In May 1526, Denk baptised Hans Hut, who would be its foremost evangelist. Later that year he debated with the reformer Martin Bucer in front of several hundred people in Strasbourg. Moving on to Worms, he and Melchior Rink built an Anabaptist community in the city and succeeded in winning over 2 young Lutheran preachers. In his final months, though, he appeared to have become somewhat disillusioned, especially by divisions within the movement. His insistence that the inner word, spiritual experience, was more important than external ceremonies and precise dogmas, and his advocacy of love and acceptance were unusual in this period of mutual antagonism between professing Christians.
Hans Hut was an entirely different personality. A bookseller by profession, he travelled widely before and after encountering Thomas Münzer. Expelled from Bibra for refusing to allow his child to be baptised, he became a confidant of Münzer and was arrested near the site of the Battle of Frankenhausen, but escaped punishment by claiming to have been selling books rather than fighting. Returning to Bibra, he engaged in rather inflammatory preaching, predicting divine punishment on unworthy clerics, and was expelled again. After his baptism in Augsburg, Hut was on the road constantly, baptising thousands and planting Anabaptist churches in major cities, towns and villages across South Germany and Austria. 3 significant converts were Leonard Schiemer, Hans Schlaffer and Ambrosius Spittelmeyer, who helped to spread Anabaptism in Austria. But Hut's fiery ministry lasted less than 18 months. Seized in Augsburg, he was tortured and died in prison in 1527 before he could be executed. Hut, like Denk and Münzer, drank deeply from the mystical tradition. Although South German and Austrian Anabaptism owed much to the radical wing of the Lutheran Reform movement, it owed rather more to the medieval German mystics, Eckhart, Tauler and the Theologica Deutsch. This gave the movement a different flavour from the biblically oriented and sober Swiss Brethren, at times charismatic, at times quietist, emphasising the importance of yielding to the will of God. Like Münzer, but unlike Denk, Hut also drew heavily on the apocalyptic sections of the Bible. This not only lent urgency to his activities, but also impacted his teaching as he presented baptism as sealing the elect for the last days, and looked forward to the punishment of the wicked, in which Anabaptists might play some part. A third but less well-known founding father of this branch of Anabaptism was Melchior Rink. A classical scholar from Hesse, who became a Lutheran preacher, Rink fought at Frankenhausen, but escaped the carnage and was probably baptised by Denk in January 1527, before working with him in Worms. In 1528 he was in Hersfeld, where he presented articles at a theological debate that resulted in his expulsion from the area. Rinck refused to accept this expulsion and continued to travel around Hesse and Saxony, preaching and baptising, until he was arrested and imprisoned in 1531. Unusually, thanks to the leniency of Margrave Philip of Hesse, Rinck was not executed, but remained in prison for the rest of his life, adamantly maintaining his Anabaptist convictions. Less is known of Rinck's theological and spiritual views than those of Hutt or Denk. He was clearly influenced initially by both Denk and Muntzer, but what evidence there is suggests that he was less interested in mysticism, eschatology and revolution. In fact, his teaching seems closer to that of the Swiss Brethren, focusing on the foundational issues of repentance, faith, baptism and discipleship. South German and Austrian Anabaptism lacked the cohesion of the Swiss Brethren. Like the Swiss, they suffered the loss of key leaders very early, but unlike the Swiss, they did not coalesce around a confession of any kind. Perhaps this was inevitable in light of the diverse convictions and personalities of Denk, Hutt and Rinck, and the emphasis on inner realities rather than externals. 4 groups evolved from these beginnings. One pursued Hutt's apocalyptic vision, another imbibed Denk's mystical spirituality, a third combined these emphases, and a fourth turned in a more separatist direction.
The other main figure in this branch of the Anabaptist movement was Pilgram Marpeck, a former mayor and mining magistrate of Rattenberg until 1528. Initially attracted to the Lutherans, Marpeck was disappointed by the lack of discipleship in their churches and became an Anabaptist. Moving to Strasbourg, where he worked as an engineer, Marpeck assumed leadership of an Anabaptist community in the city until exiled in 1532. After a period on the move interacting with Swiss and Moravian Anabaptists, he settled again in Augsburg and led an Anabaptist community there until his death in 1556, one of very few Anabaptist leaders to survive so long unmolested. Marpeck's social position meant that he needed to wrestle seriously with the question of how far to engage with the power structures of his day without compromising his Anabaptist principles. The groups associated with Marpeck seem not to have survived, but his significance for the movement lies elsewhere. Not only did he write extensively, but he corresponded with Anabaptists in other areas, and his writings reflect the intra-Anabaptist discussions that were taking place during the first 30 years. His own position was a mediating one, as he encouraged the more literalist Swiss and the more mystical South German groups to learn from one another. Contemporary Anabaptists often find Marpeck the most attractive and accessible of first-generation leaders. Cities such as Strasbourg and Augsburg all offered some freedom for Anabaptist churches to meet and for Anabaptist ideas to be debated, but the threat of persecution was never far away. As pressure from the authorities increased, many South German and Austrian Anabaptists looked to Moravia with its sympathetic landowners as a place of toleration, and waves of refugees made the journey there. Although Swiss Brethren refugees joined them, and Balthasar Hubmaier had been influential in setting up the early communities, it was South German and Austrian Anabaptists who dominated the burgeoning Anabaptist communities in Moravia that would eventually be known as Hutterites, after an early leader, Jakob Hutter.